In our previous lessons, we were working on determining triangle congruence, looking for given information to see if it met the requirements below: side, angle, side, 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 hypotenuse, leg, remember that's only for right triangles, angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. So let's take a look at a couple practice problems that we've been doing in the past and see how we can use those to help us move forward, determine if triangles are congruent. So here we have two sets of problems here. In our first triangle set, we know that segment DE is congruent to CE, BE is congruent to AE. Based on those given information, could you determine the triangle congruent statement and by what reasoning? Similarly, with number 2, you have your given information here. Based on that, can you complete the triangle congruent statement and the rationale behind it? So our first set, we know that the triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. We came to that determination because angle DEA is congruent to CEA because they are vertical angles. Therefore, when we're matching our corresponding parts to name the triangle, right, we can use the tick marks. If I go DEB, notice how it's the single, then your angle, and then the double. We're going to do the same thing here. Single, angle, double. Now for number 2, we have 3 pairs of congruent segments. Therefore, the 2 triangles would be congruent by side, side, side. And again, using the tick marks to help us, if we say triangle ABC, so that's how it went to the single, double, triple. We're going to repeat that pattern here. That would have to be NLM, single, double, triple. So we know, based on the given information and making the assumptions that we're allowed to make for diagrams, like vertical angles being congruent to each other, we can complete some triangle congruency statements. Now, since we can identify those features, we want to become a little bit more formal in writing some geometric proofs. So what does that mean? Well, we've talked about in each of the problems the given information, right? We always start with given information. And then we look to see, well, what else do we know about the problem to help us arrive at the solution? And notice that when always we're completing these types of proofs, they were ending with naming the congruent triangle pairs and the rationale behind it. So when we write our formal proofs, we know what we should end with, and we know what we should start with, the givens. So if we had a problem like this, let's say, and they said, here's your given information, can you prove the triangles are congruent? What we typically do is create 2 columns, and one is called your statements and one is your reasons. So the statements are, what do we know? The reasons are, why or how do we know that it's true? And again, with the proofs, what they say to prove, that's our conclusion. We know what we need to end with. So a lot of times what I suggest students do is, with your proof statement, put that in your proof first, right? We know what we need to end with. So that would be at the end of my proof. And since we're talking about triangle congruence, things we want to keep in mind as we're writing this proof are the ways that we can prove triangles congruent, right? Here's our 5 methods. So we're going to kind of keep that in the back of our mind when we're writing the proofs. So we know what we want to end with, and we also know what we want to begin with. We're going to start with the given information, what we know is true. And I like to go one by one. So I would take the first given and put that here as my first step of my proof. I know DE is congruent to CE because I was told that it has to be true. So I like to color code my picture to go with my reasons. And then I always ask myself, well, if DE is congruent to CE, is there anything else I know that has to be true about the situation just based on that given? And knowing those 2 segments isn't telling me more information, so I'm just going to kind of cross that one off the list as being used, and then I'm going to go to the next given. If it did tell me something more, then I would add that to my proof. So our next given was BE is congruent to AE. So again, I marked that in my picture. And I asked myself the same question. Does knowing that BE is congruent to AE tell me anything else about my scenario? In this case, it doesn't. It just knows that these segments are congruent. So then I've used up all of my givens. Well, I'm going to ask myself, what else do I know has to be true in this diagram? And again, we can see we have a pair of vertical angles. So we know angle DEB is congruent to CEA. Then we always reflect and say, okay, does that tell me anything else about the situation, or is there anything else I can conclude about my proof? And if I notice my tick marks, I see the angle being included by the two congruent sides. That's enough to prove triangle congruence by side angle side. So we have our formal triangle proof in our two-column format. Notice it was just like your warm-up, except we're writing it a little bit more standardized, telling why we know something is true and how we're using it to come to our conclusions. So again, the proof statement is always last. Start with your givens one at a time, and always ask yourself, what else do I know about the situation based on these givens, or what can I assume from the diagram to fill in the remaining steps? If we looked at your example 2 again, right, and we want to write our formal proof for this, we know what we need to end with, the proof statement. So that should be at the bottom of our proof. We also want to be thinking about the ways we can prove it congruent. So I'll keep those over here on the side. So what can we start with? We're going to start with our givens. And our first given was AB is congruent to NL. So I'm going to put that in my proof and mark it in my diagram. And say, okay, well, do these two segments being congruent tell us anything else about the scenario? It does not. So we move on to the next given and mark that. CB is congruent to ML. And again, ask yourself, does that tell me anything else about the scenario? It does not. So again, do we have another given to use? Yes, we do. AC is congruent to NM. We mark that in our picture and we say, okay, is there anything else we know about the scenario based on that given, or any other conclusions we can make? Well, we can see that we have 3 pairs of congruent segments. And that's one of the ways to prove triangles congruent. That would be by side, side, side. So we have everything we need in this proof complete. We have our rationale, right? We know what we wanted to end with. We know what we started with to complete our proof. So let's try another one and see how we can formulate our formal proof based on the givens and the proof statement. So here is our next example. Again, your formal proof statement, do your 2 columns, statements and reasons. We know what we want to end with is the proof statement. So we're going to put that in our proof at the very end. And we're also going to keep in mind the ways to prove triangles congruent. So our goal is to make one of these appear in our diagram for our proof. So what's going to be one of the first lines of our proof? We start with our first given. So we know that AE is equal to CE, and we mark that. And we ask ourselves, well, does this being congruent to that tell us anything else about the situation? It does not. So we say, okay, what's our next given we can use? Our next given is the measure of angle D is equal to the measure of angle B. And we know that because it's given to us. So I'm going to mark that in our diagram and ask myself now, again, knowing that these 2 angles are equal in measure, does that tell me anything else about my situation here? And it does not. So I've used up all my givens. Now I have to look at the diagram and say, okay, what else do I know has to be true based on what I'm seeing here? And hopefully your eyes are being drawn right here. And we can see that we have a pair of vertical angles. So we're going to name those vertical angles and put that in our proof. We know that angle AED would be congruent to CEB. Then we ask ourselves again, okay, knowing that those vertical angles are congruent, is there anything else I know about my situation here? And again, our goal was to prove the triangles are congruent. So if we look at our diagram, we have 2 pairs of angles congruent, followed by a pair of congruent sides. And as I look at my ways to prove triangles congruent, 2 pairs of angles followed by a side, that's one of our methods. And we know the 2 triangles would have to be congruent by angle, side, angle. And now we've successfully completed our proof. So let's try another one. Here is our given information, here is our proof statement, and here is our diagram. If we're going to write a formal proof, again, we're going to set up our two columns, statements and reasons. And we know what we should end our proof with. That's our proof statement. So we're going to put the proof statement into our proof at the very end, and we're going to keep in mind if we're asking to prove triangles congruent, these are the 5 methods that we can use. And that's what we're going to be looking for as we complete our proof. So now, what are we going to start our proof with? Well, we're going to start with the first given, where segment AB is parallel to segment DC. And we mark it. Remember, marking parallel lines, we use the arrow tick marks to denote that. Well, parallel lines. Does that tell me any other information about my diagram? Well, we know parallel lines, when intersected by a transversal, form congruent angle pairs. So are there any congruent angle pairs we could use and mark in our diagram? Well, if BD is the transversal, angle 2 and angle 1 are related to each other. Remember, those are a pair of alternate interior angles, and we know that they are congruent. So we're going to add that to our proof. Angle angle ABD is congruent to angle CDB. So now we're going to go back and say, okay, do we have any other given information to help us? And we do. Angle A is congruent to angle C. So we're going to put that into our proof and mark it in our diagram. And we're going to ask ourselves again, by knowing that angle A is congruent to angle C, does that tell me anything else about what I know is happening here? And it doesn't. It just says the angles are congruent. So we've used up all of our givens. We're going to look at our diagram and say, okay, is there anything else that we know has to be true here that can help me reach my goal of proving the triangles are congruent? Because if I look right now at my statements and reasons, and I look at my picture, the triangles that we're focusing on here right now only have 2 pairs of angles congruent to each other, right? We have the pair of blue angles marked and the pair of purple angle marks. So I've got 2 pairs of angles. So I have a couple of possibilities in my proof statements. Maybe it's this one, maybe it's this one, but I'm missing a third piece to complete the total rationale as to why the triangles are congruent. So what else do we know by looking at our diagram has to be true? And hopefully your eyes are being drawn right here. This is a shared side for the 2 triangles. And so if they both are using that side measurement isn't changing. It's equal to itself. And remember, this is called our reflexive property. A segment that's being used by 2 figures would always be congruent to itself in measure. It's not going to change at all. The same could refer to an angle as well that's being shared by 2 figures. So we know that a measurement of a segment is always equal to itself, and an angle that's always equal to itself when used for various figures. So again, we were looking at having these 2 possibilities as our ways of being congruent. But now having the side congruent, the question is, are we going to use angle side angle or angle angle side to prove the triangle's congruent? And the order matters. Angle side angle, remember the side is included in between the 2 angles pairs that are congruent. Angle angle side means that the side is not in between the 2 angle pairs that are congruent. If we go back and look at our diagram from before, remember we can see the difference. Here's the side included in between the 2 angles versus not being included in between the 2 angles. For this proof, we need to use angle angle side to prove the triangle's congruent, because the side is not in between the 2 pairs of congruent angles. So we reviewed how to write our proofs. We know that when we look at the information, we're going to kind of think of it as writing a paper. We have the proof statement as your conclusion, so we know what we're going to end up with. So that was the very first thing we wrote down in our proof. And because we were talking about triangle congruence, we kind of kept on the side the ways in mind that we could prove those triangles congruent. Then we went back to the givens, right? And we thought about, oh, these are our pieces of evidence that we can start with. So that got us going for our first few lines of our proofs. Each time that we used a given, we always asked ourselves, does that given tell us anything else about the situation? That's like for here, with those lines being parallel, we knew to look for special angle pairs that might be congruent to each other. And again, take those givens one by one, and when they're all used up, look at your diagram, say, is there anything else that we're allowed to assume to be true, like reflexive property or a vertical angle pair, and see if that helps bridge the gap based on what you have in your proof to get you to the very end with the rationale as to why the triangles are congruent. One thing that you could do also on the side to help you is as you're marking your information in your proof, if you're talking about angles being congruent, sometimes I've seen students take a pen on the side and just put like an A, or if it's a side that's congruent, they put an S. And by tracking based on the order that they're doing in their proof, sometimes it helps them determine what method to use for the proof. So we had the two angles followed by the side, and we can see in the picture. That's been helpful for some students. You don't have to do that, but you might want to keep that in mind as you're writing your proofs. So what you're going to practice today is doing some proof writing on your own. We're going to start, again, using some kind of fill in the blanks to get you thinking about writing the proofs and the order things go in. We're going to probably have some drag and drops to complete the proofs, and then we're going to have you go through and write your own steps to complete the proofs and follow the process that was laid out in the video.